Picture the Shield Maiden. She stands on the deck of a longship, wind whipping through her braided hair, axe in hand, eyes fixed on a foreign shore. This image, popularized by shows like Vikings, has become a powerful symbol of the Norse world. It's a vision of a society so fierce that some of its women were warriors, equal to men in both courage and combat. The Shield Maiden we see on screen is a modern creation, forged from centuries of myth, literary invention, and a few tantalizing fragments of evidence. Was the Shield Maiden a rare exception to the rule, or a purely literary invention designed to explore the boundaries of a rigidly defined world? The search for an answer takes us from the pages of medieval writers to the soil of a Swedish burial ground to the pages of Byzantine history. Shield maidens appear most prominently in the legendary sagas, heroic tales that were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the Viking Age had ended. These stories weren't strict histories. They were a blend of folklore, myth, and oral tradition, often colored by the Christian worldview of their authors. In the Norse imagination, the Shield Maiden was often conceptually linked to the Valkyries, Odin's supernatural warrior maidens, who chose which warriors would live and die in battle. The sagas sometimes blur this line intentionally, creating characters who are both mortal and mythic, human warriors touched by the divine. Lagertha is arguably the most famous, thanks almost entirely to modern media, but her story comes from a single source, the Gesta Danorum, or the Deeds of the Danes in English. This was a 12th century history written in Latin by the Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus. Saxo introduces Lagertha as a skilled Amazon, who, along with other noble women, wear men's clothing to fight alongside Ragnar Lothbrok, her husband. She fights with such ferocity that Ragnar credits her alone for his victory. However, Lagertha's historicity is highly doubtful. Saxo was a Christian cleric writing centuries after the events, and his work is known to blend history with fiction, heavily influenced by classical Roman models. His description of Lagertha as an Amazon is a clear nod to these traditions. Furthermore, her character serves a narrative purpose for this Christian writer. Instead of being seen as a strong, powerful female warrior, Saxo likely intended to portray her as a moral warning against the perceived chaos of pagan societies. In his view, what he was portraying was a woman who was abandoning her divinely ordained role. This was intended to be viewed with disgust by his audience, though it clearly began resonating differently, starting as early as the 19th century. A crucial piece of evidence for the existence of historical shield maidens comes from an external, near-contemporary source. The 11th century Byzantine historian John Skylitzes, chronicling a battle in 971, recorded a stunning discovery. After defeating a force of Scandinavian warriors at the siege of Dorostalon in Bulgaria, the victorious Byzantines were stripping the dead, as was the style at the time. What they found was shocking. They discovered armed women among the fallen warriors. This account is invaluable because it comes from an outside observer with no stake in Nordic literary traditions. Importantly, this wasn't a generalized tradition in Byzantine histories either. This wasn't some trope inserted routinely, mocking their enemy for having to resort to using women to fight for them. In fact, scholars view this account as being much more likely to be factual because this came from a hard-fought victory. Simply put, the Byzantines had no incentive to say that they had difficulty fighting a force made up partially of women. In fact, admitting so was a bit of a challenge to the masculinity of their warriors. For centuries, these were, in essence, the only evidence for shield maidens. But in 2017, science offered a stunning new clue. The focus of the search for a real shield maiden has since centered on a 10th century burial in the Viking trading town of Birka, Sweden. Excavated in the 1870s, it was immediately hailed as the tomb of a high-ranking warrior. The grave was lavishly furnished with a full arsenal of weapons: a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, and 2 shields. It also contained the remains of 2 horses, a mare, and a stallion, essential for a mounted warrior. Most significantly, a full set of gaming pieces was found in the individual's lap, suggesting the deceased was not just a fighter, but a military leader. For over 140 years, the occupant of this archetypal warrior grave was assumed to be male, an assumption based on the martial nature of the grave goods. Given that every other Viking grave like this that's ever been found has been associated with a male, this of course was a sensible conclusion, but it was very wrong. Bone analyses in the 1970s and again in 2014 suggested the skeleton was female, but these findings were largely dismissed by the academic community. The paradigm shifted when a team of researchers published the results of a genomic study. DNA extracted from a tooth and an arm bone proved conclusively that the individual possessed 2 X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. The high-ranking warrior of Burka was, in fact, a woman. The revelation ignited a firestorm of academic debate. Skeptics raised objections. Perhaps the bones had been mixed up with another burial over the centuries since their excavation, or maybe the weapons were simply symbolic heirlooms. The research team noted that the grave goods were arranged in direct spatial relation to the female skeleton, and that the burial completely lacked any traditionally female artifacts. In the end, the truth of the Shield Maiden likely lies in the space between myth and reality. The Shield Maiden, as a common, recognized class of warrior fighting in shield walls alongside men, is almost certainly a literary invention of the sagas and later writers. Yet, the powerful converging evidence of the Swedish grave and the Byzantine account demonstrates that individual women likely did take up arms on rare occasions. At present, the discovery of new primary sources or new archaeological evidence may one day shed more light on this Norse historical mystery. On June 20th, 1941, a team of Soviet archaeologists in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, cracked open the heavy stone sarcophagus of one of history's most feared conquerors. Legend claims they found a chilling inscription: "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." Just 2 days later, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. Coincidence, of course, but the story perfectly captures the terrifying, almost supernatural reputation of the man in that tomb. Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane. His life's ambition was to restore the glory of the Mongol Empire, a goal that required him to match the conquests of its founder, Genghis Khan. But to truly succeed, he needed more than just a peerless army. He needed the one credential that mattered above all others in his world: the sacred blood of Genghis Khan himself. The question of whether he possessed this golden lineage is more than a matter of genetics. It's a story of ambition, political genius, and the masterful manipulation of power in a world defined by the legacy of one man. Tamerlane was born in the 1330s in Transoxiana, the heartland of the Chagatai lands, a vast territory in Central Asia. This was once a proud quarter of Genghis Khan's unified Mongol Empire, but by Tamerlane's time, however, that unity was a distant memory. The Mongol world had fractured into successor states, and the Chagatai state was arguably the most chaotic of them all. It had effectively split into a settled, Turkified western region where Tamerlane lived, and a more traditional nomadic Mongol east known as Mogulistan. Power wasn't in the hands of a single ruler, but was contested by rival Turco-Mongol tribal chieftains, known as emirs, who fought endlessly for supremacy. Tamerlane began his career as just one of these ambitious local warlords, a minor noble from the Barlas tribe who started as a sheep rustler and mercenary. In this fractured landscape, one law remained absolute. It was the unwritten constitution of the steppe. Only a man who could trace his ancestry directly, through the male line, to Genghis Khan could hold the supreme title of Khan. These descendants formed a sacred ruling class known as the Altan Uruk, or the Golden Family. This massive extended family is known to historians as the Chinggisids, after the proper pronunciation of Genghis Khan's name. To claim the title of Khan without this bloodline was unthinkable. This presented an enormous barrier for an upstart like Tamerlane, who wasn't a member of this exclusive club. The power of this principle is proven by the very chaos it governed. Powerful warlords who commanded large armies and controlled vast territories still didn't dare call themselves Khan. Instead, they propped up powerless Chinggisid princes as figurehead rulers to legitimize their own authority. They held the power, but the Golden Family held the title, a situation which Tamerlane wasn't willing to subject himself to, at least not fully. While he would never claim the title Khan himself, he figured out a way to claim something equivalent, and perhaps even better. His genius lay in recognizing its absolute power and turning this immense constraint into the very foundation of his imperial identity. Facing this insurmountable political reality, Tamerlane couldn't change his birth, so he constructed a multi-layered case for his right to rule. He built the building blocks of legitimacy, with each piece designed to strengthen his position and appeal to different audiences. His first and most historically sound claim came from his paternal lineage. Tamerlane was a member of the Barlas, a prominent Turco-Mongol tribe. Crucially, the Barlas were not complete outsiders. They were originally a Mongol clan that had been part of the early confederation that formed around Genghis Khan. Medieval sources, including the Mongols' own secret history, confirm that the Barlas and Genghis's Borjigin clan were related. They were considered sub-clans that shared a common male-line ancestor named Tumbanai Khan. This made Tamerlane a distant cousin of the Chinggisid lines. It was a legitimate connection that placed him firmly within the Turco-Mongol aristocracy. It gave him a vital foot in the door, but it wasn't a direct line of descent from Genghis Khan. Essentially, it granted him enough legitimacy to have status, but not sovereignty in his own right. His second claim, through his mother, was far more ambiguous, and likely a work of propaganda. Some court historians suggested his mother may have been a descendant of Genghis Khan, while other accounts linked her to legendary Persian heroes or holy men. The fact that the story kept changing suggests it was a flexible tool, tailored to impress different audiences, be they Mongol traditionalists, Persian subjects, or the clergy. This claim was also important because ultimately, it did make him a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, just through his daughters rather than his sons. Tamerlane's third claim, however, was his political masterstroke. In 1370, after a long and bloody rivalry, he defeated the ruler of Transoxiana, his own brother-in-law Amir Hussein. As the victor, Tamerlane took Hussein's widow, Sarai Mulk Khanum, as his own principal wife. Sarai Mulk Khanum was a direct, high-ranking descendant of Genghis Khan. This marriage was a calculated and transformative political act. It didn't change the blood in his veins, but it formally and undeniably grafted him onto the imperial family tree. In fact, according to accounts he pushed to the Mongol aristocracy, this was more of a coming home than anything, since he claimed maternal descent from a daughter of the great Khan. With his legitimacy portfolio established, Tamerlane put his strategy into action. He meticulously respected the ultimate political taboo and never called himself Khan. He ruled with the title of Emir, meaning commander or prince. To satisfy the rigid requirement of a Chinggisid on the throne, He maintained a series of puppet khans, in whose name official decrees were issued and coins were struck. This maintained the crucial fiction of Chinggisid rule, allowing Tamerlane to wield absolute power without ever claiming the forbidden title. His marriage to Sarai Mulk Khanum, however, allowed him to adopt a title that was, in practice, just as powerful. He styled himself as the Gurkhan, meaning the royal son-in-law, and this unusual title became the cornerstone of his imperial identity. He even named his dynasty the Gurkhani, the royal in-laws, explicitly advertising his connection to the house of Genghis Khan as the very basis of his state. The title was a brilliant solution to an impossible political problem. It allowed a non-Chinggisid to wield supreme, Khan-like power by leveraging the prestige of the Golden Family itself. In a world of powerless puppet Khans, being the all-powerful son-in-law made him the true master. The scholarly consensus is clear and unwavering. Tamerlane was not a direct paternal descendant of Genghis Khan. His paternal line was a branch of the family tree that split off long before Genghis was born. The claim that his mother was a direct descendant of the great Khan is likely a fiction too. However, even if it was true, this wouldn't have made a difference, because this wouldn't have made him a Chinggisid prince regardless. Tamerlane's true genius wasn't in his bloodline, but in his profound understanding of the political culture he inhabited. He saw that the legacy of Genghis Khan was an immutable force of nature, and instead of trying to break it, he ingeniously bent it to his will. He was a conqueror on a scale few have ever matched, a ruthless pragmatist who built pyramids of skulls outside the cities he sacked. Yet, unlike Genghis Khan, who created a durable administrative system that long outlived him, Tamerlane's empire was a personal possession. It was built on personal loyalty to him and designed to funnel the wealth of the world to his magnificent capital at Samarkand. Because it was his and his alone, it fractured almost immediately upon his death in 1405, existing as a fragmented rump state for the next century. In the end, the man in the Samarkand tomb wasn't a son of the Golden Family by birth. He was an outsider who, through sheer force of will, brutality, and unparalleled political cunning, forced his way into the family portrait. He proved that while it was best to be born with the blood of a Khan, it was possible to conquer large portions of the world by forcibly marrying into the family. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Also, don't forget that you can support my work for as little as $1 a month through the YouTube membership by clicking that join button or through the Patreon. In the spring of 802 AD, after decades of brutal warfare, a surrender took place that should have ended a conflict, but instead sealed a people's fate. The great Emishi chief, Aterui, a brilliant commander who had once humiliated the armies of the Japanese emperor, walked into the camp of his enemy. This was the Yamato general Sakanue no Tamuramaro. It wasn't a surrender in defeat, but a calculated bid for peace for his people. Tamuramaro, a warrior who respected his foe, argued for clemency, hoping to use Atarui's authority to govern the newly conquered north. But the court in the distant capital of Heian saw things differently. They saw a symbol too dangerous to live. Atarui and his top lieutenant were taken far from their homeland, and in a stunning betrayal, were executed. This single act reveals the heart of the Emishi story. They weren't simply barbarians on the edge of civilization. They were a complex and formidable people who represented the last major obstacle to the unification of Japan under the Yamato Emperor. Their long struggle against the imperial state was a clash of worlds that didn't just define a border, but forged an empire. To the courtiers and scribes of the imperial court, the world was divided into two parts: the civilized center under the emperor's divine rule, and the barbarian periphery. The Emishi were the quintessential other on their northern doorstep. They inhabited the vast, rugged Tohoku region of Honshu, a land the Yamato called Michinoku, or the deepest road in English. In official histories like the Nihon Shoki, the Emishi are consistently portrayed through a lens borrowed from Imperial China. They are uncivilized, disobedient, and in need of the emperor's civilizing influence. The very name Emishi, written with Chinese characters, was likely a pejorative, possibly meaning shrimp barbarians. This is thought to be a reference to either their diet or their long beards. By painting the northern tribes with a single derogatory brush, the Yamato court created an ideological justification for conquest. This transformed simple territorial expansion into a righteous mission to tame the wilderness. In reality, the people behind the label were far more complex. Japanese and Chinese records describe them as kibito, or hairy people, a physical trait that distinguished them from the Yamato or Japanese people. This suggests a strong connection to Japan's indigenous Jomon population, the archipelago's original hunter-gatherer inhabitants. This has led to the long-held theory that the Emishi were the direct ancestors of the modern Ainu people of Hokkaido. However, there were a number of distinctive and important differences. The Emishi of Honshu were skilled horse breeders and practiced rice cultivation, traits not associated with the later Ainu culture of Hokkaido. Ultimately, Emishi was less an ethnic descriptor and more a political one. It was a blanket term for any group in the north who refused to submit to Yamato authority, who shared some loose cultural traits. These groups were diverse, likely including Jomon descendants, mixed populations, and even ethnic Japanese settlers who had gone native and sided with the locals. The Japanese themselves acknowledged this diversity, classifying some of the Emishi as traitors due to their Yamato origin. The Emishi thrived in the harsh northern environment through a resilient, mixed economy. They were hunters and fishers, but also cultivated grains like millet and barley, and in fertile river valleys, they grew rice. Their most significant cultural and military asset, however, was the horse. They were master horse breeders, a skill possibly influenced by contact with continental cultures, and the horse was central to their way of life. They lived in tribal communities, likely organized around chieftains, in settlements of pit dwellings clustered into small hamlets. Their material culture was distinct, favoring clothing of animal hide and their iconic curved, single-edged short sword. Their religion was likely quite similar to folk Shinto beliefs, coming with an animist understanding that everything in the world around them had a spirit. They worshipped the nature around them, and bears were likely considered by far the most sacred animal in their world. Interestingly, despite being pushed in by a powerful centralized state built on the Chinese model, the Emishi figured out a way to hold out through force of arms. Their entire military doctrine was built around the horse archer. They perfected a devastating style of mobile warfare, using hit-and-run tactics to harass and destroy their enemies. An Emishi band could sweep down on an enemy force, unleash a storm of arrows, and vanish back into the hills before a response could be mounted. Against the Yamato court's army, which was modeled on Chinese-style heavy infantry, this was a revolutionary approach. The slow-moving, heavily armored imperial soldiers were easy targets, unable to cope with the speed and fluidity of Emishi cavalry. The Emishi, much like their steppe counterparts on the other side of the Sea of Japan, were raised in the saddle. This allowed them to perform feats of horsemanship that seemed superhuman to their enemies. This tactical superiority by a barbarian group had a profound and lasting impact on Japanese history. The repeated, humiliating defeats of the 8th century made it brutally clear that the old ways were obsolete. To conquer the north, the Yamato had to abandon their Chinese models and become like their enemy. This necessity, born on the northern frontier, was the crucible in which the samurai was forged. The court began to favor warriors that fought on horseback with bows, just as the emishi did. The frontier thus became an engine of innovation, with the tactics of the so-called barbarians providing the blueprint for the warrior class that would dominate Japan. The long-simmering conflict between the Yamato and the emishi erupted into open war in the late 8th century. The Yamato state, then in its Nara and early Heian periods, was in an era of ambitious centralization. From their grand capitals, first at Nara and then Heian, modern Kyoto, a succession of emperors sought to impose a unified legal and administrative system. The independent tribes of the north were a direct challenge to this imperial vision, since they remained fiercely independent. In 774, a series of emishi uprisings triggered what historians would later call the 38-Year War, a prolonged and bitter struggle for control of northern Honshu. Initially, the conflict was a disaster for the Yamato. Their large, conscription-based armies were consistently outmaneuvered and defeated. The conflict's defining early moment came in 789 at the Battle of Sufusei. A massive imperial army pushed deep into emishi territory, only to be lured into a brilliant trap set by the chief Adarui. Pinned against the Kitakami River, the Yamato forces were attacked from all sides and collapsed into a panicked rout. Over 1,000 soldiers, weighed down by their heavy armor, drowned trying to escape. It was a catastrophic defeat that sent shockwaves through the court. The emishi were superior warriors, but they were fighting a war of battles against an enemy that was waging a war of systems and logistics. The Yamato state, with its bureaucratic organization and vast resources, could absorb such losses, raise new armies, and sustain a conflict over decades. Under the determined Emperor Kanmu, the court changed its strategy. They began building a network of fortified administrative centers, called Josaku, deep in emishi lands. These forts, like Isawa Castle, acted as forward bases, allowing the Yamato to project power, control territory, and slowly choke the resistance. They also promoted a new type of commander, Sakanue no Tamuramaro, a man who understood the new way of fighting. He was given the new title of Seitai Shogun, Great Barbarian Subduing General, a title that would acquire significant importance in the coming centuries. In 801, Tamuramaro led a 40,000-strong army north in a final, overwhelming campaign that broke the back of the emishi resistance, leading to Adarui's surrender the following year. As the chief of the powerful Isawa Federation, Adarui emerged as the central figure of the resistance. He was a military genius who united the northern tribes and defied the full might of the empire. His stunning victory in 789 transformed him from a regional leader into the living embodiment of emishi strength and independence. His nemesis, Sakanue no Tamuramaro, was his mirror image, a brilliant general from a family of Chinese origin who represented the adaptable, relentless power of the Yamato state. For years, Adarui held him at bay, but Tamuramaro's campaign of attrition and fortification gradually wore down the emishi. The construction of Fort Isawa in the very heart of Adarui's homeland was the final checkmate. Faced with the inevitable, Adarui chose to surrender, placing his trust in the honor of his rival to secure a future for his people. That trust was betrayed by the court, but Adarui's story was far from over. While Tamuramaro was celebrated and eventually believed to be the avatar of a Buddhist god, Adarui underwent a strange and telling transformation in folklore. The historical human leader was recast as a supernatural monster, a great demon king who controlled the north of Honshu. In popular legends, the 38-Year War was no longer a human conflict, but a mythic battle between the heroic Tamuramaro and a terrifying Oni. This was a testament to the profound fear Atarui had inspired. To be a worthy opponent for their greatest hero, he couldn't have been a mere mortal. In the end, the Japanese turned the very real men on both sides of the conflict into supernatural entities. Tamaramaro was an avatar of a sophisticated Buddhist god of war, while Adarui was the chaos of nature turned into a virtually unconquerable demon king. In a way, this was a coping mechanism. Barbarians weren't winning on their own. They were led by a minor god. The end of the war in the early 9th century marked the beginning of the end for the Emishi as a distinct people on Honshu. Their fate fractured along three paths, and many who submitted were simply assimilated. They were settled into new administrative districts and were often enlisted into the Yamato military to help pacify the remaining hostile groups. Over generations, they intermarried with Japanese settlers and were absorbed, their ancestry becoming a component of the modern people of the Tohoku region. Notably, this fact is still visible in genetic studies today. Other Emishi chose exile over submission. They fled north across the Tsugaru Strait to Hokkaido, leaving their horses and rice paddies behind. Some believe that these refugees are the primary ancestors of the Ainu. If this theory is true, in the relative isolation of their new island home, their culture evolved differently, leading to the distinct identity of the Ainu people. As for when the Emishi fully disappeared as a distinct group on Honshu, this isn't fully known. Scholars believe that the last Emishi villages were likely fully assimilated by the late 12th century. Notably, in literary works starting in the 13th century, the Emishi are used to describe ancient barbarians of the north. This reference suggests that by that time they were a distant and nearly forgotten memory. The year is 500 BC at Olympia in Greece. The air is thick with the smell of olive oil, sweat, and sacrificial smoke. Athletes from across the Hellenic world, men from Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, are gathered for the most sacred and prestigious of all competitions, the Olympic Games. To compete here was to affirm one's place in a shared Greek identity. But a disruption is brewing. A man from the north, a king named Alexander I of Macedon, has declared his intention to race. Immediately, his rivals protest. The contest, they argue, is for Hellenes, for Greeks, not for foreigners, not for barbarians. This moment, recorded by the historian Herodotus, cuts to the very heart of one of ancient history's most contentious questions. The identity of the Macedonians wasn't a simple matter of fact. It was a subject of fierce debate, legal challenge, and political maneuvering. For his part, this much less famous Alexander didn't respond to the accusation by pointing to his kingdom's culture or language. Instead, he made a legal and genealogical claim. He argued that his royal house, the Argead dynasty, wasn't native to Macedonia, but descended directly from the Greek city of Argos. More importantly, he claimed that his family was descended from the greatest of all Greek heroes, Heracles. The matter was brought before the Hellenodikai, the official judges of the games. After examining the evidence of his lineage, they delivered their verdict. Alexander's claim was valid. The royal family of Macedon was officially recognized as Greek, and the king was permitted to compete. This episode is a perfect microcosm of the Macedonian paradox. It reveals that Greekness in the ancient world wasn't a monolithic ethnic identity, but a negotiated status. For the Macedonian king, his Hellenic identity was simultaneously denied by his peers on cultural grounds and affirmed by a Panhellenic authority on genealogical grounds. His people's place in the Greek world wasn't self-evident. It had to be proven, and even then, the acceptance was often grudging and incomplete. Over a century later, the the kingdom of Macedon rose from a peripheral power to a dominant force under King Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. The question of its identity became a matter of existential urgency for the city-states to the south. From their perspective, particularly that of the Athenians, the Macedonians were fundamentally different. They were stereotyped as a rough, pastoral people, living a backward lifestyle more akin to the heroic age of Homer than the sophisticated urban culture of the polis, or city-state. Their original capital, Aigai, was even derisively known as Goat Town by the Athenians and other confirmed Greeks. This cultural condescension was deeply intertwined with political ideology. While southern Greece had evolved complex systems of democracy and oligarchy, Macedonia retained what many saw as an archaic and tyrannical form of government. They had a monarchy, where power was concentrated in a king and a martial nobility that derived power through force of arms. To the citizens of a fiercely democratic Athens, this was antithetical to the very concept of Hellenic freedom and civilization. No one weaponized this perception more effectively than the Athenian orator Demosthenes. In a series of powerful speeches known as the Philippics, delivered in the mid-4th century BC, he launched a blistering propaganda campaign against the Macedonian threat. Demosthenes' rhetoric was deeply personal and ethnic. He famously declared that Philip wasn't merely a non-Greek, but something far worse. He was a barbarian pretending to be Greek, a despotic wolf in sheep's clothing lying about his origin. It is essential, however, to recognize these speeches for what they were: masterful works of political rhetoric, not objective ethnography. Demosthenes' goal was to galvanize a fractured Athens into action against a leader who was outmaneuvering them at every turn. By deliberately conflating Macedonia's different political system with barbarian status, he could portray Philip as an illegitimate outsider, an existential threat to the entire Greek world. This view was not universally shared. Other prominent Greeks, like the orator Isocrates, saw Philip not as a barbarian destroyer, but as a potential unifier. To them, he was a fellow Greek with the strength to lead a pan-Hellenic assault against their common enemy, the Persian Empire. The intense Athenian hostility, therefore, reveals less about the objective reality of Macedonian ethnicity and more about an internal Greek hierarchy. In the eyes of many Southerners, to be truly and properly Greek, one had to adhere to the political and cultural model of the polis. By failing this ideological test, the Macedonians could be rhetorically cast out of the Hellenic family for political expediency. For centuries, the debate over Macedonian identity was fueled by these conflicting literary accounts. There was little hard evidence to settle the matter of what language the common people actually spoke. Some scholars argued that Macedonia was ruled by a Hellenized elite, but that the common Macedonians were something different entirely. The idea that Macedonian was an Illyrian language had strong currency in the world of academic historians. This changed dramatically in 1986, with a remarkable archaeological discovery in the ruins of Pella, the ancient Macedonian capital. Unearthed from a grave dating to the first half of the 4th century BC was a small rolled-up sheet of lead. When carefully unfurled, it was revealed to be a katadesmos, or curse tablet, a type of magic spell common throughout the Greek world. The text was a desperate plea from a woman, possibly named Phila, to the spirits of the underworld. She sought to bind her lover, Dionysophon, and prevent him from marrying another woman named Thetima, asking the spirits to ensure he would marry her instead. This was something drafted by an ordinary person, not a member of the high aristocracy, but the most revolutionary aspect of the tablet was its language. It wasn't written in the formal Attic Greek used by the royal court for official business. Instead, it was inscribed in a distinct local dialect that scholars identified unequivocally as a form of Northwest Greek, with strong affinities to the Doric family of dialects. The Pella Curse tablet is considered a game changer, providing the first concrete evidence of the vernacular spoken in the Macedonian heartland. Its discovery has shifted the modern scholarly consensus decisively toward the view that ancient Macedonian wasn't a foreign language, but a northern dialect of Greek. It shows an ordinary Macedonian woman, far from the royal court, participating in a common Hellenic magical religious practice. She used her native Greek dialect to express universal human emotions of love, jealousy, and desperation. This suggests that Hellenic culture wasn't merely a thin veneer adopted by the elite for political prestige. Greek culture was woven into the fabric of daily life, belief, and language for the general population. When all the evidence is weighed, a complex picture emerges. In many fundamental ways, the Macedonians were deeply integrated into the Hellenic world. They worshipped the same Olympian gods as other Greeks, with Zeus, Apollo, and Heracles holding places of honor. Their kings acted as high priests and were patrons of major Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. From the 5th century BC onward, their elite class increasingly embraced Southern Greek art, literature, and customs, with Attic Greek becoming the language of the court. Their inclusion in Pan-Hellenic festivals and the acceptance of their royal family into the Olympics were formal acknowledgments of their place within the Greek community. Yet, in other crucial aspects, they remained a world apart. Their society was not built around the independent city-state, but was a tribal kingdom ruled by a monarch and a powerful, land-owning nobility. This structure was more similar to that of their neighbors in Epirus and Illyria than to Athens or the other city-states. They also retained certain archaic customs, like specific burial practices, that had long been abandoned in the south. This duality was not entirely unique. Other peoples on the fringes of the Greek world also lived in tribal societies rather than city-states and spoke Northwest Greek dialects. They too were sometimes labeled as barbarians by southern writers like Thucydides, despite their undeniable Hellenic heritage and participation in Pan-Hellenic life. This places the Macedonian question in a broader context. The core of the ancient Greek-Macedonian divide wasn't primarily ethnic, linguistic, or religious, but political and ideological. The conflict was between two competing models of Hellenic civilization. For the Southerners, and especially the Athenians, the citizen-centric polis was the pinnacle of human achievement and the only legitimate expression of a civilized Greek life. Any Greek-speaking people who didn't organize themselves in this way were, by definition, backward, uncivilized, and barbaric. In the end, there was no single objective answer to the question of whether the Macedonians were Greek, because Greekness itself was a fluid and contested concept. To a political opponent like Demosthenes, they were dangerous barbarians. To the Olympic authorities, their kings were legitimate Greeks, even if there were questions about their common folk. To the Macedonians themselves, they were a distinct people who were also the rightful heirs to a heroic Hellenic lineage. In fact, to the Macedonians, they were more Greek than the city dwellers who had abandoned the ancient ways. The perception of their identity was entirely situational, depending on who was asking and for what purpose. This centuries-long debate wasn't resolved by philosophical argument or historical proof, but by the force of arms. Philip II, the so-called barbarian from the north, took a kingdom on the verge of collapse and transformed it into the most formidable military power in the region. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, his reformed army decisively crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, largely ending the era of the independent Greek city-state. Philip then established the League of Corinth, a federation that united the Greek states under his command, ostensibly for a great pan-Hellenic strike against the Persian Empire. His son, Alexander the Great, inherited this unified force and unleashed it upon the world. In one of the most breathtaking campaigns in history, he overthrew the Persian Empire and carried Greek language, art, and philosophy to every corner of the known world. This process, which we call Hellenization, was a deliberate policy of cultural fusion, creating a new, cosmopolitan civilization that blended Greek and Eastern elements. The ultimate irony is that the group whose Hellenic identity was most fiercely contested became the very instrument by which Greek culture achieved its greatest global influence. The modern academic consensus, informed by discoveries like the Pella tablet, now largely views the ancient Macedonians as a people on the northern fringe of the Greek-speaking world. They were Hellenic in their language and core culture, but possessed a distinct political and social identity that set them apart from the city-states of the south. In 1749, on the tiny windswept island of Corvo, the most remote outpost of the Azores archipelago, a furious Atlantic storm clawed at the coastline. For days, waves battered the shore, and when the tempest finally subsided, it had stripped away the earth from the foundations of a ruined stone building. There, a local reportedly found broken black pottery. Inside lay a trove of strange, ancient coins, some gold, some bronze, bearing unfamiliar markings. This discovery ignited a mystery that has smoldered for over 250 years, posing a radical question. Could the masters of ancient Mediterranean trade, the Carthaginians, have colonized these isolated islands nearly 2 millennia before the Portuguese? This single dramatic find stands in stark opposition to the official, well-documented history of the Azores. The consensus, established for half a millennium, holds that Portuguese navigators in the 15th century discovered a pristine, wholly uninhabited archipelago. The Corvo coins, however, suggest a much older, more mysterious past. While the specific claim of Carthaginian colonization rests on unsubstantiated evidence, the controversy itself has inadvertently opened the door to new scientific inquiries. These modern investigations have successfully overturned the long-held consensus, revealing a far more complex history of human contact with the Azores than previously imagined. Inheriting a legacy of their Phoenician ancestors, the Carthaginians built a commercial and naval empire that dominated the Western Mediterranean for centuries. Their power was projected by their primary naval vessel, the oared galley or quinquereme, a machine built for the specific conditions of their home sea. These ships were designed for speed and maneuverability, engineered for ramming tactics in the relatively contained waters between Sicily and Spain. They were lightweight, with shallow drafts, and packed with hundreds of rowers and marines ready for combat. However, these very design features made them profoundly ill-suited for the open Atlantic. Quinqueremes were notoriously unseaworthy in heavy storms and had almost no space for the food and water required for a long-distance voyage. Their operational model often required crews to sleep ashore nightly, a clear impossibility on a 1,500-kilometer journey across the open ocean. Their navigation techniques, while sophisticated for the era, were similarly constrained. Lacking magnetic compasses, Carthaginian sailors relied on celestial bodies, particularly the pole star, and detailed coastal charts. The surviving account of Hanno the Navigator's celebrated expedition down the African coast perfectly illustrates their methodology. He sailed along the coastline of West Africa, founding colonies in stages, never making a speculative leap into the unknown blue water. Even if a Carthaginian ship were blown off course and miraculously survived the journey to the Azores, an even greater challenge of the return would await. The North Atlantic is governed by a formidable system of winds and currents. A voyage west from the Iberian Peninsula means sailing directly into the prevailing westerlies and the powerful Gulf Stream. The return is harder still. The Canary Current and the northeast trade winds create a natural conveyor belt that pushes vessels southwest, away from Europe and deeper into the Atlantic. It wasn't until the 15th century that Portuguese mariners perfected the revolutionary technique known as the volta do mar, or turn of the sea. This counterintuitive maneuver required sailing far to the northwest, seemingly away from home, to catch the westerly winds that could finally blow a ship back to Portugal. Without this knowledge, any accidental discovery of the Azores would have almost certainly been a one-way trip. The case against a planned Carthaginian colonization isn't a single point of failure, but a systemic one. It combines a lack of motive with the wrong ships, inadequate navigational tools, and an insurmountable environmental barrier. The entire case for a Carthaginian presence in the Azores hinges on the Corvo find, yet the evidence itself is extraordinarily weak. The story comes to us not from a contemporary account, but from a report published in 1778 by a Swedish academic, Johann Franz Puddelen. He was recounting a conversation he'd had 17 years earlier, in 1761, with a Spanish numismatist who told him about the discovery from 1749. This third-hand narrative, relayed decades after the event, is a fragile thread from which to hang history. Furthermore, the crucial physical evidence, the pot and the coins themselves, vanished almost immediately. All that remains are Poddelen's drawings of the coins, making modern scientific analysis, such as examining the metal for signs of long-term saltwater exposure, impossible. This lack of physical proof has led modern scholars to propose several powerful counter-theories. Some suggest the find was an outright hoax, or that the coins were planted by later visitors, such as Arabs, Normans, or even early Portuguese colonists. The latter theory suggests that the Portuguese, during their Golden Age, had attempted to present themselves as equals to the Carthaginians. Other scholars proposed a simple case of mistaken identity. The coins may have been found not on the Azorian island of Corvo, but in a town named Corvo in mainland Portugal. In this case, Poddelen was simply confused, because the Carthaginian presence in the mainland Corvo would have been absolutely unremarkable. Proponents often link the coins to another local legend, an equestrian statue of a man pointing west, supposedly found on Corvo by the first Portuguese explorers. Like the coins, however, the statue was destroyed in the 16th century, no verifiable drawings survive, and its existence is just as poorly documented. For 5 centuries, the historical record was clear. The Portuguese, beginning with Diogo de Silves around 1427, discovered and settled an empty archipelago. This narrative remained largely unchallenged until 2021, when a groundbreaking study completely rewrote the timeline. Instead of digging for coins, an international team of scientists drilled into the mud at the bottom of Azorian lakes. By analyzing sediment cores, they looked for biomarkers that signal the presence of humans and their livestock. What they found was unambiguous. In layers of sediment dated to between 700 and 850 AD, they discovered high concentrations of 5-beta-stigmasterol. This is a compound found in the feces of large mammals like cows and sheep, alongside spores from a type of fungus that only grows on animal dung. This evidence proves that a pastoral community was living and farming in the Azores a staggering 700 years before the Portuguese arrived. By analyzing climate models from that period, the study's authors noted that anomalous wind patterns would have made sailing from northern Europe to the islands unusually favorable. This conclusion is bolstered by another intriguing line of evidence. The island's mice genetics links them not to the Iberian Peninsula, but to populations in northern Europe. The question is no longer a binary choice between the official Portuguese story and the fringe Carthaginian theory. The scientific proof of a Norse-era presence means the foundational premise of the traditional narrative, that the islands were never inhabited, is definitively wrong. While the Norse presence is now backed by hard science, another, even more ancient possibility remains locked in a heated and unresolved debate. Since around 2010, researchers on the island of Terceira have documented a number of strange structures and markings that they claim are the work of ancient peoples. These include man-made chambers cut into the rock into arrangements of massive stones that resemble European megalithic tombs. Some proponents have suggested these finds could date to the Bronze Age or even earlier, drawing parallels with ancient Mediterranean and Northern European cultures. This interpretation, however, faces strong scientific opposition. A commission established by the Portuguese government in 2013 concluded that the structures were either natural geological formations or recent constructions. They argue instead that these are natural grooves formed over millennia by the grinding action of large tree roots on the soft volcanic rock. This effect is exacerbated by constant wind and the region's frequent micro-earthquakes, at least according to this official explanation. In the final analysis, the romantic tale of Carthaginian explorers colonizing the Azores is an unsubstantiated legend. It's a story built on a flimsy foundation of second-hand accounts and lost evidence, and it crumbles under the weight of logistical, technological, and environmental improbabilities. The true historical breakthrough has come not from chasing ancient myths, but from the rigor of modern, multidisciplinary science. The definitive discovery of a Norse-era presence has shattered a 500-year-old consensus, proving that the Portuguese weren't the first to make a home on these remote Atlantic islands. The ghosts of the Atlantic may not be Carthaginian, but they are real, and we're only just beginning to learn their names and histories. They were the civilization that taught Rome the alphabet, the art of divination, and the spectacle of the gladiatorial arena. Their engineers drained the marshes to build Rome's first great sewer, and their architects designed the city's most sacred temple. These were the Etruscans, one of the most influential people in history, not in their own right, but because of who they in turn influenced. For over a century, according to tradition, the last three kings of Rome were Etruscans themselves. Yet for all their profound influence, the Etruscans are a paradox, a people whose own voice is almost silent. We can read their script, which they adapted from Greek traders, but their language remains a baffling mystery. It's a non-Indo-European island in a sea of Italic tongues. This linguistic puzzle has fueled a 2,500-year-old debate, one that began with the ancient Greeks and is only now finding a resolution through the lens of modern science. The central question has always been the same. Who were the Rasenna, as the Etruscans called themselves, and where did they come from? At their zenith around 600 BC, the Etruscans were the first superpower of the Western Mediterranean. Their heartland was Etruria, a resource-rich region in west-central Italy, what we now call Tuscany, defined by the Arno and Tiber rivers. This land of fertile soil and abundant mineral deposits, especially iron and copper, was the engine of their prosperity. From this base, their influence spread north into the Po Valley and south into Campania. The Etruscans were never a unified empire, but a loose confederation of 12 powerful and independent city-states. Governed first by kings and later by oligarchies of aristocratic families, these cities grew fantastically wealthy through extensive trade networks. They were connected with the Greeks, Phoenicians, and Egyptians through these Mediterranean trade routes. Their society was known for its luxury-loving elite, who filled their grand tombs with imported treasures and commissioned vibrant frescoes depicting lavish banquets. These elaborate tombs, laid out in grid patterns like cities of the dead, provide most of our knowledge about Etruscan life. They reveal a people skilled in metalworking, urban planning, and hydraulic engineering, who mastered the use of the arch and vault long before the Romans made them famous. The debate over Etruscan origins began in antiquity, framed by two competing narratives that have shaped the conversation ever since. The first and most famous comes from the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus. He recounted a dramatic tale of migration, claiming the Etruscans were originally Lydians from Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. According to his story, a devastating multi-year famine gripped the kingdom of Lydia. To survive, the king divided his people by lot. One half remained, while the other, led by his son, Prince Tyrannus, built ships and set sail in search of a new home. After a long journey, they landed on the coast of Italy, settled the land, and became known as the Tyrrhenians after their prince. This narrative of an Eastern exodus became the dominant explanation in the classical world, cementing the image of the Etruscans as foreign arrivals. Centuries later, a powerful counter-argument emerged. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian living in Rome during the 1st century BC, systematically dismantled Herodotus's theory. He applied a surprisingly modern comparative method, observing that the Etruscans of his day shared no discernible language, religion, or customs with the Lydians. Finding no evidence of a shared heritage, he concluded that the Etruscans were not immigrants at all, but an indigenous people who had always inhabited the Italian peninsula. Herodotus's story may have reflected the political realities of his time. It was perhaps a myth created to explain the lucrative trade relationships between the wealthy Lydian kingdom and the Etruscan city-states. In contrast, Dionysius's argument for a native origin fit neatly into the political project of Augustan Rome, which sought to construct a unified Italian history. For Emperor Augustus, this transformed the Etruscans from foreign predecessors into one of Italy's foundational peoples. For centuries, the debate remained a literary one. The shift came with modern archaeology, which provided the first physical evidence to test the ancient claims. The consensus among archaeologists today is decisive. Etruscan civilization wasn't imported wholesale from the East, but developed directly and continuously from the preceding Iron Age culture in the same region. This is known as the Villanovan culture, and it flourished between 900 to 700 BC. Major Etruscan cities like Tarquinia were continuously occupied from the Villanovan period onward, showing a clear line of cultural descent. The Villanovan culture, named for a site near Bologna, is now considered the earliest phase of Etruscan civilization. It was characterized by huts and a distinctive burial rite of cremation, with ashes placed in small, hut-shaped urns that mimicked the homes of the living. And I have to say that there's something quite endearing about this funerary ritual, imagining your ancestors in a comfy little home that you keep inside your home. But I digress. The archaeological record shows no evidence of a sudden invasion or population replacement that would signal a mass migration. Instead, it reveals a gradual evolution. Over time, the practice of burial began to appear alongside cremation, and simple villages coalesced into larger, more complex settlement. This transformation accelerated dramatically, beginning around 750 BC, when the Proto-Etruscans came into contact with the greater Mediterranean world. Spurred by intense contact with Greek and Phoenician traders, a flood of new ideas, technologies, and luxury goods poured into Etruria. The emerging Etruscan elite eagerly adopted Eastern artistic styles, feasting practices, and status symbols like gold jewelry and ivory carvings. This sudden influx of Eastern culture was once seen as proof of Herodotus's theory, but it's now understood as the result of dynamic trade and cultural exchange, not migration. The archaeological evidence reframes the entire question from where the Etruscans came from to how the Villanovans became Etruscans. The Etruscan language remains the greatest source of the civilization's mystique. It's a language isolate, a non-Indo-European tongue unrelated to the Italic languages like Latin spoken by its neighbors. While over 13,000 short inscriptions exist, they are mostly funerary, offering names and formulaic phrases but little in the way of literature. For decades, the most tantalizing clue was the Lemnos stele, a 6th century tombstone found on the Greek island of Lemnos. It was inscribed in a language with striking structural similarities to Etruscan, confirming a linguistic link to the Aegean. For many, this was the hard evidence that proved Herodotus right. However, modern scholarship views this link through a different lens. The inscription dates to a period of peak Etruscan maritime power, long after the supposed migration. It's more likely that the Lemnian text represents an outpost of Etruscans in a colony. In essence, it's a sign of their expansion eastward, not a relic of an Eastern origin. The language's uniqueness isn't a sign of foreignness, but of deep, local antiquity. It is almost certainly a relic language, a survivor from a pre-Indo-European linguistic map of Italy. It is the language of the Villanovans and their Bronze Age ancestors, preserved through the strength of their culture against the tide of Indo-European expansion. The final verdict in this ancient debate has come from the 21st century science of genetics. Early studies, which analyzed the DNA of modern Tuscans and even their cattle, found intriguing genetic links to the Near East, seemingly vindicating Herodotus. However, these studies couldn't distinguish between an ancient Etruscan migration and much later genetic mixing during the Roman Empire. The breakthrough came with the analysis of ancient DNA extracted directly from the bones of individuals buried in Etruscan tombs. A landmark 2021 study, analyzing the genomes of 82 individuals who lived in the region between 800 BC and 1000 AD, reached a clear conclusion. The Etruscans were genetically indistinguishable from their Italic neighbors, such as the Latins of early Rome. They shared the same genetic profile, a mixture of ancestry from earlier Neolithic farmers and later Bronze Age pastoralists who arrived from the Eurasian steppe. There was no genetic evidence for a recent mass migration from Anatolia. The Etruscan gene pool remained stable for nearly 1,000 years, only changing dramatically during the Roman imperial period. This was when large-scale movements of people from across the Mediterranean transformed the genetic landscape of Italy. The genetic link between modern Tuscans and the Near East dates from this later era, not from the time of the Etruscans. This genetic revelation solves one mystery but creates a more profound one. The Etruscans carried the same steppe-related ancestry as their Indo-European-speaking neighbors, yet they spoke a completely unrelated, non-Indo-European language. This challenges the simple assumption that genes and languages always travel together. The most likely scenario is that the Bronze Age migrants who brought Indo-European languages to Italy didn't replace the existing population in Etruria. Instead, they integrated into the established Proto-Villanovan society, adopting the language of the local community. The weight of modern evidence from archaeology and genetics is now overwhelming. The Etruscans were an indigenous Italian people, their civilization a brilliant flowering that grew from the local Villanovan culture. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, it turns out, was right. The ancient story of a Lydian migration, while a compelling tale, isn't supported by the physical or biological record. The Eastern characteristics that so fascinated observers were the fruits of dynamic trade and cultural exchange, not the baggage of a displaced people. The unique Etruscan language isn't a foreign import, but a linguistic fossil, a survivor from the pre-Indo-European era of Italy. In short, after 2,500 years of debate, starting with Herodotus, the great Etruscan enigma is finally resolved. In the middle of the 6th century, the city of Constantinople was the center of the known world. It was the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, a sprawling metropolis of marble, gold, and silk, all ruled by one of the most ambitious men in history, Emperor Justinian I. From his great palace, Justinian was reshaping civilization. He was codifying 1,000 years of Roman law, raising the magnificent dome of the Hagia Sophia, and sending his armies to reclaim lost territories in Africa and Italy. His was an empire of order, faith, and absolute authority. Yet for over 50 years, in the very waters that served as the city's lifeline, a power existed that obeyed no emperor. It was a creature of immense size and unpredictable fury, a living monster that literally ate Roman seamen for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The Byzantines gave it a name: Porphyrios. This is the story of the whale that terrorized the world's greatest city and became a personal obsession for the emperor who couldn't defeat it. Our knowledge of this incredible saga comes from a single indispensable source, the historian Procopius of Caesarea, a high-ranking official who chronicled Justinian's reign. Procopius describes a beast that menaced the waters around Constantinople for more than half a century. Porphyrios wasn't a constant threat. The animal would sometimes vanish for long periods, allowing a tense calm to settle over the waterways. But its returns were always sudden and violent, reinforcing its terrifying, almost supernatural reputation. The whale's attacks were indiscriminate and devastating. It made no distinction between a humble fishing boat and a merchant vessel laden with precious grain from Egypt. It even rammed and sank dromons, the sleek, powerful galleys of the Roman navy. The attacks were most common in the Bosphorus Strait, the narrow channel that separates Europe from Asia and serves as the gateway to the capital. The psychological impact was immense. The mere reputation of Porphyrios was enough to cause panic. Captains would often take long, costly, and time-consuming detours to avoid the areas the whale was known to frequent, disrupting the vital flow of commerce. For Emperor Justinian, Porphyrios was understood as something beyond a mere economic or maritime hazard. It was a profound and public challenge to his authority. Justinian's entire reign was built on the concept of the restoration of the Roman Empire's former glory. He saw himself as God's chosen ruler, a figure of absolute power tasked with imposing order on a chaotic world. His administration sought to control everything from silk production to religious doctrine, and his armies were re-establishing Roman dominion across the Mediterranean. Yet, this whale represented a force of pure chaos operating with impunity in his own backyard. The security of Constantinople's sea lanes was not a trivial matter. The city was the hub of a vast trade network that connected Europe and Asia, and its very survival depended on the steady flow of ships through the Bosphorus. This maritime commerce was a cornerstone of the imperial economy, heavily regulated and taxed by the state. Porphyrios was a direct threat to this critical infrastructure. Procopius states plainly that Justinian made it a matter of great concern to eliminate the creature. Despite making it a matter of imperial concern, Justinian's best minds couldn't devise any effective way to hunt or trap the beast. This failure was a stark and embarrassing symbol of the limits of human power. Porphyrios was a living, breathing refutation of the imperial image of omnipotence, an untamable sovereign of the sea that answered to no law but its own. For millennia, historians and later scientists have debated the true identity of this legendary creature. Procopius, Writing in an age when whales were poorly understood and often viewed simply as sea monsters, provides just enough detail to fuel two competing theories. The first possibility is that Porphyrios was a sperm whale. The reported size fits, as does the lengthy lifespan, which could easily span the 50-year period of its activity. Sperm whales are also known for their aggressive temperament and have been documented ramming ships, a behavior that aligns perfectly with the accounts. Herman Melville, in his research for Moby Dick, came across the story and concluded that Porphyrios was likely a sperm whale. Given the extreme influence of Melville, this understanding has had a profound impact on how people view this creature. However, this theory has problems. These whales are exceedingly rare in the eastern Mediterranean. Further, Procopius mentions that the whale was hunting dolphins when it met its end, a behavior not typical for the deep-diving, squid-eating whale. This leads to the second major theory. Porphyrios was an unusually large orca. This identification is supported by the whale's location and its reported diet. Orcas are found in the Mediterranean and are famous for hunting dolphins. One hypothesis suggests that a young orca may have become trapped in the Sea of Marmara, where an abundance of prey allowed it to grow to a monstrous size. The main argument against this is Procopius's measurements, which describe a creature far larger than any known orca. The maximum size for an orca in the wild is about 32 feet, which isn't incredibly far off the 45 feet associated with Porphyrios. It's possible, of course, that terrified eyewitnesses exaggerated its size, a common phenomenon when facing a traumatic event. Just as mysterious as its species is its name. The origin of Porphyrios is uncertain, but the theories reveal how the Byzantines tried to comprehend the beast. It may have come from the Greek word porphyra, meaning a deep, wine-dark purple, perhaps a description of the animal's skin color. Under this theory, some have translated his name as Purple Boy, basically a sign of affection for the sea-bound monster. Another theory connects it to Porphyrion, a mythological giant who dared to wage war against the gods, framing the whale as a primordial, god-defying force. A third possibility is that it was named after a famous and beloved charioteer of the era. Perhaps most compellingly, the name could evoke the imperial purple, the color strictly reserved for the emperor. In this light, the name is a sign of grudging respect, an acknowledgement that this creature possessed a majesty and power that made it a rival emperor of the sea. After 50 years of terror, the end for Porphyrios came not from an imperial ship, but from its own primal instincts. One day, while chasing a pod of dolphins near the mouth of the Black Sea, the great creature pursued its prey too far into the shallows and ran aground in thick coastal mud. It struggled mightily to free itself, but its immense weight only caused it to sink deeper, sealing its fate. Word spread like wildfire through the nearby communities. The monster that had plagued their parents and grandparents was helpless on the shore. A mob quickly formed, armed with axes, ropes, and a thirst for revenge. Their initial attacks were futile, and Procopius states that their axe blows on its thick flesh had little effect. But the people were relentless. They returned with heavy ropes and wagons, dragging the behemoth further inland, away from any chance of escape. There they set upon it again, finally managing to hack the great creature into pieces. The relief was immense and immediate. Procopius tells us that some of the locals ate the meat right there on the beach, while others took their portions home to be cured. It was a final, visceral act of dominion over the beast that had held them in fear for so long. Yet, even in victory, a sliver of fear remained. A rumor began to circulate that the whale they had slain was not the true Porphyrios, but some other unfortunate creature. Ultimately, we don't know whether this was truly the beast, or whether this was just some unfortunate whale that took the brunt of the fury on behalf of Porphyrios. Anyway, let me know if you enjoyed these whale tales in the comments, because if you did, I've got 2 more stories I want to drop.